I would like to continue in that theme based on the words of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. And this comes from a publication that we've kind of updated a little bit the wording on it. He published in 1802, the year before his transition, the Spiritual Ministry of Humankind. So I'd like to refer to two sections of this if we have time. I think we will. It's a quite extensive book, but so I'd like to kind of look at, to begin with, a point that he makes, and I will try to help us kind of interpret a little bit the language of 18th century France and the very poetic ways very often that people wrote at that time in Europe, and to help us perhaps begin our own reflections on it. And he speaks of two worlds, outward and inward, and this is really, I think, very important for us as what you were just going through with that meditation, right? We were really kind of addressing the inward world, right? There's an outer world, we close our eyes, and that opens a door for us as we kind of deactivate our attention to our physical senses, creates a door for us to go to that inward world. And he, in this writing, kind of really helps emphasize the significance and importance of that for us to understand. So just begin with his words. He said, "We shall see a light arise, which may at first seem strange, but it will not be the less real. It is that if humankind, who, be it remembered, is not of this world, is a sure and direct means of demonstration of the divine essence, and if proofs taken from the external order of this world are defective and incomplete, and if the hypotheses and abstract truths which we attribute to this world are taken from the metaphysical order and have no existence in nature, it clearly follows that we comprehend nothing in the world we are in, but by the light of the world in which we are not. That it is much easier to attain to the light and certainty which shine in the world in which we are not, than to naturalize or adapt ourselves with the shadows and darkness which envelop the world in which we are in. In short, it must be said that we are much nearer to what we call the other world than we are to this one." And that paragraph really captures very much, let's say, the mysticism, our realization and our pursuit of this inner world. So he's noting that the outer material world of the senses, which is really what is meant by the outer world here, the matter and the world of the senses, does not reveal to us the essence of existence. And that very often we are turning to things related to the more abstract world, metaphysical world, to explain to ourselves and to help understand these things that we experience. Keeping in mind that the outer world is actually illusory in the sense that it is simply a creation of our senses. And as we know, we speak of generally 5 physical senses, and it is the input from those senses interpreted by the brain that give us our impression of the world. That's the world as we know it. It is a very small pinhole, so to speak, into the actuality of existence. But nevertheless, that is the outer world that we spend most of our conscious awareness in and focused on. And what he is pointing out here, that is the inner world, that this inward world, that is actually of more significance. Continues, "It will not even be very difficult to acknowledge that to call the outer world, to call the other world, the world in which we are not, is a misuse of the term. And that this world, that is the world of matter and the senses, is in fact the other world to us." So he's pointing out here is that we refer to this inward world as the other world, and kind of describing it as the world in which we are not in, and declaring basically that the world of matter and the senses is kind of our notion of the world. And he's pointing out that it is in fact the other world to us, that we have a divine origin, which is the true nature of our world. It's this inner world is the true nature of our being in our world, and is the sensory world that is created, but we come to believe in everyday ordinary life that that is the real world, and these other things are the other world. And his point he's making here is the reality is the other world is in fact the real world for us, and this sensory world is truly the other world. So he continued, for strictly speaking, two things may be respectively the other to each other, right? One's the other to the other. There is nevertheless a priority between them, either in fact or conventionally, which requires the second to be considered as the other in respect to the first. This is my other thing as compared to my primary, this is my other, and not the first as the other in respect to the second. For that which is first is one and can offer no difference, having no point of comparison before itself, whereas that which is second finds that point of comparison before it, which is always obviously in comparison to the original. So such is the case with the two worlds in question. And I leave it to the reader to compare the light and certainties we find in the metaphysical order, or what we call the other world, with the obscurities, approximations, and uncertainties we find in the one we inhabit. So we know even our physical material scientists are not able to fully explain the phenomena of this outer world that we come to be socialized or to come to believe is the world. But it is really approximations, uncertainties is the language he uses. And for those who are familiar with areas of quantum physics, there's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which basically says that nothing can absolutely be known in terms of when you get down to the fundamental kind of particles or parts that make up our physical reality. So he's comparing these obscurities and approximations to the certainties that we can draw and light you can draw from the metaphysical order. And he continues, I also leave it to the reader to pronounce whether the world we are not in is the world that we are not in has not some right to priority over the world we are in, on account of the perfections in science it affords us and the superior antiquity it seems to have over this world in which we are imprisoned. So he's again making this case, and it really is kind of foundational, I would say, for us as students of mysticism, that this outer world of the senses, which is a totally manufactured and created world based on our sensory apparatus and the state of our brains, right? The condition of our brains in interpreting the vibrations received through our sense organs, right? That world that most of humanity, most of the time, takes to be this is the real world, is not really. It is but a kind of a creation. It's an obscuration of really the real existence that we are connected to and part of. So as we talk about as students of mysticism about going within, we're talking about going into the inward world, which is actually infinite in nature, of infinite quality and potential and power, as compared to the quote unquote outer world, the world of our senses. So when we kind of think about who and what we are, we can become confused through our education, our ordinary education and training, to believe that this outer experience is who and what we are, as compared to this inner aspect of ourselves that, in a sense, is the thing that cognizes the input from the senses and is the experiencer of the input of the senses, though it is not the senses. It precedes the senses, and it really is kind of an infinite nature of potential as compared to the limited finite nature of the material world. And he continues, he said, and I also leave it to the reader to pronounce whether the world we are not in has not some right to priority over the one we are in, on account of the perfections and science it affords us, and the superior antiquity it seems to have over this world in which we are imprisoned. For none but slaves of ignorance and hasty judgments could think that mind descends from matter, and therefore what we call the other world from this, while this, on the contrary, seems to derive from the other and come after it. So let me kind of help clarify these others and thises a little bit. And he begins really with one of the most compelling points of science, and for several hundred years, including the present, and the assertion by most of traditional Western science that somehow consciousness arises from the chemicals and molecular activity in our brains, or the electrical activity in our brains, right? That basically consciousness descends or comes from matter. And of course, they've not been able in any way to be able to bridge that gap of how do you get consciousness from what would seem to be inert matter. And so he begins, and it's interesting, he's here in the later part of the 18th century making this statement, but none but slaves of ignorance and hasty judgments could think that mind descends from matter. And therefore what we call the other world from this. Therefore the other world being, let's call it the immaterial world, that somehow is coming from matter, this everyday experience that we have through our senses. He said, while this, on the contrary, seems to derive from the other and come after it. And that really is the fact that our consciousness creates the reality that we perceive, creates the sensory experience that we receive. We know through our Rosicrucian studies that all is vibration, but it is our consciousness that interprets those vibrations to create the ideas of forms and shapes and time and space and all those type of things from simply vibration of spirit energy. And in that way, he says that, on the contrary, this kind of material experience is derived from the other, the immaterial, and comes after it. It's a product of it. It is not the source of consciousness. It is the product of it. And so this inner world that we have. So again, coming back to when we, as students of mysticism on this journey, right, we're seeking constantly, say, to go within. Within, again, is not in our bodies. It's not like, oh, we're going to go inside our chest. No, it's in this consciousness, this inner world that is basically infinite in nature. And, it was immortal because, as we see, the evidence we have of consciousness surviving, quote unquote, death, what we call transition as Rosicrucians, but surely surviving its separation from the material body, that this aspect is what is immortal and infinite and unlimited compared to the material parts of ourselves. He continues, this also shows how much the human soul must be out of its line of descent, imprisoned in these material elements, and how far these material elements or this world is from sufficing to show the divinity. So I'll just repeat that sentence. It says, this also shows how much the human soul must be out of its descent, kind of out of its source, imprisoned in these material elements. And we see a lot of reference, particularly in Saint-Martin's writing, about the soul coming into matter, right? Again, one of the things we see in our Martist teachings, but you'll find in this literature, the origin of the soul is God. The origin of humankind is the soul coming into matter, or the human race is the soul coming into matter, right? So in that sense, we often see these references, the notion of being imprisoned in the material elements. Now, obviously, it's for a certain reason, and we also know if we look at the experience of reported for near-death experiences, we see very often the accounts of those things, speaking of the sense of freedom and liberation, of course, in making that transition from the physical body. So, but he makes this point, and some of other of his writings emphasize this, that the material world is not sufficient to show the divinity. No matter how we look at it, it does not suffice to show the divinity. He says, moreover, strictly speaking, we never do go out of the other world, or the spirit world, though so few people believe in its existence. So every time we go to sleep at night, every night when we go to sleep, right, we enter into that other world. Right? We have experienced in that other world. So, and the reality is the other world is immanent in us because uh, if we look at the intelligence that governs our bodies and our respiration, the cells, and all these things, that we actually are never separated from that world. And if we know as students of mysticism that we can turn our consciousness inward and actually communicate and have various experiences in that world, that inner world, right? Which say, we are taught to believe is the other world, but as he's pointing out, our essence is in that world. Our consciousness, the root of our consciousness is in this quote unquote other world, which therefore is not so much the other, but the primary source of our expression of our nature and our being. So again, he says, moreover, strictly speaking, we never do go out of the other world or the spirit world, though so few people believe in its existence. We cannot doubt this truth, since to give value to the proofs we draw from matter or this world, we are obliged to lend it the qualities of mind, or those things of supposedly of the other world. The reason is everything depends upon spirit. So everything that we experience is actually kept in existence, maintained by this aspect of that is beyond the senses, our material senses, and which is therefore referred to as the other world, but it really relates to this limitation of our physical senses, not enabling us to discern it, but we have other ways of realizing it. He continues, so he says, thus the only difference between people is that some are in the other world knowing it, and the others are there without knowing it, right? So thus the only difference between people is that some are in the other world knowing it, and the others are there without knowing it. And we, as students, again, of mysticism, we realize that we are also in this other world. What you just did in that exercise, in that meditation with the Grand Master, right, was taking ourselves into that other world of our being. Right, we divorced ourselves from paying attention to the physical senses so that we could experience this other aspect of our being. And as we can sense, there are no limits to it. So there are some people who are in the other world knowing it, and there are others there who are there without knowing it. And he says, and from this, there is the following progression. This is quite interesting. He says, God is in the other world knowing it, and God cannot but believe and know it. For being the universal spirit itself, it is impossible there can be any separation for God, between God and the other world itself. So that's a quite beautiful thing. All right, so we know Samartin has pointed out to us, and it's actually referred to a little bit in these writings, again, the door by which God goes out of itself, it enters into the human soul, right? So as we kind of turn inward into this other world, this inward world, right, is where we can commune with the God of our heart, the God of our realization, in real time, in a real way, solid, as tangible as perhaps the chair you're sitting in or any other things that you believe you experience. So that's that avenue. So there's our our motivation, as we're very often instructed to do, is to go within, right? So it's in this inner world that is being referred to, and it's in this inner world that we can basically contact and experience, our relationship to the divinity and the source of our being. So the other topic I wanted to turn to out of this, and I say it's a quite extensive book, so we're just going to touch on two of the topics in it today. And the other one has to do on divine and spiritual things, because it very much relates again to this dual nature, so to speak, right? And he says, and I'm just reading because it's also very beautifully and poetically put. And he says, but there are two kinds of mysteries. One comprises the natural mysteries of the formation of physical things, their laws and modes of existence, and the object of this existence. The other comprises the mysteries of our fundamental being and its relationship with its principle. All right. So in many ways, we're talking about the outer world again and the inner world. He said the final intent of a mystery cannot be to remain altogether inaccessible, either to the understanding or to the sweet sense of admiration which our souls are for which our souls are made. and which we have already recognized as a first necessity for our immaterial being to feed upon. I'm going to read that again. So the final intent of a mystery cannot be to remain altogether inaccessible, right? So there's an answer to be found, so to speak, right? He said either the final intent of a mystery cannot be to remain altogether inaccessible, either to the understanding, kind of the intellectual comprehension, or to the sweet sense of admiration for which our souls are made, and which we have already recognized as a first necessity for our immaterial being to feed upon. He said, the intent of the mystery of nature is to raise us. And this is that kind of outer world, right? The intent of the mystery of nature is to raise us through the discovery of the laws of physical things to the knowledge of the higher laws and powers by which they are governed. So the intent of the mystery of nature is to raise us through the discovery of the laws and physical things to the knowledge of the higher laws and powers by which they are governed. All right, so pointing us beyond. So the knowledge of this mystery of nature and all that it constitutes cannot then be prohibited now, otherwise its final intent would be missed. So the study of nature and the physical laws, right, provide a kind of a window, so to speak, right, to let us look and see and begin to imagine about the nature of the inner aspect and the higher powers and laws that govern these things. So we know, as an example, when the Hubble Space Telescope was launched and now the James Watson telescope into space, the things that reveal, the pictures that we saw, right, again, so inspired us, right, that began to contemplate and think about our own nature, right, and the nature of our experience and humanity on this planet, right? So, and as we search inwardly in the body, in the physical organism of the body, and see the marvelous nature of the body, the brilliance and intelligence that governs it, right, it suggests to us a higher nature, a higher intelligence, a divine intelligence, a creator behind it. So, therefore, it is, as he said in his words, the study of this, the knowledge of this mystery of nature cannot be prohibited, because otherwise its final intent would be missed. Its intent to help us to basically recognize the creator that has brought it all into being, that divine intelligence. Then he says, the final intent of the mystery of divine and spiritual things, this is our inner work, which is connected with that of our own being, is to move us and excite in us sentiments of admiration, tenderness, love, and gratitude. So the final intent of the mystery of divine and spiritual things, which is connected with that of our own being, to that inner world, is to move us and excite in us sentiments of admiration, tenderness, love, and gratitude. And again, the exercise that the Grand Master concluded with, right, is a wonderful platform for that journey, right, to taste it and experience it. This mystery of divine and spiritual things ought, then, to be allowed to penetrate to the very ground of our being. Otherwise, this double mystery, which connects us with divine things and divine things with us, would fail of its effect. So I'm going to read this again. The final intent of the mystery of divine and spiritual things, which is connected with that of our own being, is to move us and excite us in sentiments of admiration, tenderness, love, and gratitude. This mystery of divine and spiritual things ought, then, to be allowed to penetrate to the very ground of our being. Otherwise, this double mystery, which connects us with divine things and divine things with us, would fail to its effect. So when we study the Rosicrucian teachings, an example of the Martinist teachings, right, we are studying this mystery of the divines and spiritual things with the aim of penetrating to the very ground of our own being, right, going deeper and deeper within our own nature, right, taking away the physical senses, but going within, and there's a world within us. So he mentions, okay, we must be allowed to pursue this because otherwise we really will miss its benefits and will not have a chance to produce its effects. He continues, but there's a great difference between these two sorts of mysteries. The mystery of nature may be more or less known, but nature itself hardly touches our essential fundamental being at all. And if we experience pleasure in its contemplation and penetrating its mysteries, the mysteries of nature, it is because we then rise above nature and ascend by its means to regions which are really analogous to ourselves. It is herein like a lantern, showing us a way to these high regions, but unable in itself to communicate their sweetness. And that's when for me at least, and I think for many people, when we see those pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope or the James Webb telescope, right? They inspire in us this contemplation of this aspect of our own nature as well. He says the spiritual and divine things, on the contrary, touch our faculties of love and admiration far more than our understanding. It seems even as though it were to prepare us for a still higher measure of admiration, that they will not so readily yield themselves to our perceptions. For if we could at will subject them to our cognizance, we should not admire them so much, and our pleasure would be less. For if it is true that our happiness is to admire, it is also true that to admire is to feel rather than to know, which is the reason why God and spirit are at once so sweet and so little known. So he's talking about here, as we penetrate these things, sometimes the experiences are very hard to put into words, but we can feel it, right? It engenders a feeling in us, even though, as it is said, these things are very often ineffable, right? Beyond the ability to describe. So, very kind of critical part. So he mentions this is by the way humankind has managed these domains, both the natural and the spiritual. They have allowed these two sources, which could have produced delicious fruit, each after its own kind, to dry up. That is, human philosophy, treating of natural sciences and keeping only on the surface, has prevented us from knowing them, and has not given us even the pleasures of understanding. As an example, the thing of consciousness is beyond physical science, and they don't even embrace it, which they would have so readily afforded, and teaches the divine things by darkening them and making them unapproachable. Very often what we find in our religious traditions, where it gets so obscured with all of the things that are arbitrarily kind of attached to these things, they have prevented us from feeling them and so deprived us of the admiration they would not have failed to awaken in us if they'd been allowed to reach us. So he says, the perfection of the mystery is to unite in a true and harmonious combination what will be at once satisfy our intelligence and nourish our admiration. This we should have enjoyed, however, if we had kept our first estate. But for the door by which God goes out of itself is the same by which it enters the human soul. And the door by which the human soul goes out of itself is the same by which it enters the understanding, which is surely our consciousness. The door by which the understanding goes out of itself is the same by which it enters the spirit of the universe. The door by which the spirit of the universe goes out of itself is that by which it enters into the elements of matter. And what's sometimes interesting to me about this particular paragraph there is it positions humankind right in between, right? We are between, God, the absolute, the soul, and then this, the material, the universe and matter, right? And the reality is we can touch all of it, right? Through our consciousness, we can touch all the way down into matter and also commune all the way up to the highest aspects through the aspects of our soul and the divine itself. So, but what I want to conclude a little bit with prayer of Saint-Martin, which I think, is an invocation in reality. And that closing prayer is, eternal source of all which is, thou send unto us those who seek thee a spirit of truth, uniting them forever with thee. May the fire of this spirit consume all the traces of the old person, and having consumed them, may it produce from those ashes a new person, on whom thy sacred hand shall not disdain to pour a holy chrism. Be this the end of penitence and its long toils, and may thy life, which is one everywhere, transform my whole being in the unity of thine image, my heart in the unity of thy love, and my activity in the unity of works of justice, and my thought in the unity of all lights.